On my recent quick road trip, I got to see a place I've always wanted to see, Harpers Ferry, West Virginia. I was really surprised by how beautiful this little town was. The train station was probably one of my favorite parts, as it's still being used today. There was people waiting to catch the Amtrak coming through, and the inside was just absolutely beautiful. I thought this was the visitor center to check in, but it is way far out of town and is a little bit confusing to find. And with COVID and things being closed down more, I had a hard time finding the visitor center, but I was glad to find the train station and check it out first. I ended up parking back here to walk around town. Ever since I saw the movie Gods and Generals, they filmed part of that in Harper's Ferry, and I've always wanted to go see it. And it is mostly all national park system owned now. There's a few homes on the outskirts. The private property is pretty rough around the outside areas, but there are some really beautiful private homes that are not part of the national park. But the national park system does a wonderful job maintaining the buildings that they have. And of course, Harper's Ferry is famous for John Brown, and of course, being a historian, I had heard these stories and read them and studied them, but I didn't really realize how large of an impact he had had on this town and how much of an impact he continues to have on this town, and just how much of the town was lost during the Civil War, in and around the Civil War, with it being an armory. The building that John Brown supposedly used as his fort is a replica. It's a reconstruction, but it was cool to get to see. I did not realize how much of a hill Harper's Ferry was built on, and the rivers are just beautiful coming together on either side of town. The stepped parapets and the old architecture was just absolutely beautiful, and it was not quite like stepping back in time, because who wants to actually do that? But it was as close as you could get with modern comfort. The rail lines are really cool to see, and the town, the part that's preserved, is very well done, and they keep it in that John Brown Civil War era impact. And one of my favorite parts was the church up on the hill that overlooks town. I unfortunately did not get to go into that, but most of these buildings that you see are open as little museum buildings with interpretive things inside, and a lot of it relates back to John Brown. You'd think he was the only guy who ever lived there, but um, the restoration is wonderfully done. A lot of the exhibits were kind of altered, and the flow was altered because of COVID, and that was kind of made things a little confusing. I was confused a lot of the time I was in Harper's Ferry, so just be prepared for that. It is kind of a hard city to figure out. I didn't realize just how many industries had been in Harper's Ferry and how many of those were burnt during the Civil War. And it gave it much more of a perspective with that John Brown School story that we all know and love. But as you walk around downtown, there is a lot of stuff going on to see, and it's easy to miss the buildings that are open because they just have little signs in the windows that you can come in, and there wasn't really anyone down there manning these buildings. But I really enjoyed to go in and see how they had the city set up as it would have been shortly before the American Civil War. They had a little extra going on because it was heading up towards Christmas time, and they had a little extra decorations. And the next day I was there was actually their Christmas open house, where Santa Claus, and they were going to have a parade and some stuff going on. I really enjoyed getting to go into these buildings. It really made the city feel like it was more welcoming than just walking around in a historic district that you could do in any town. There has been a history of flooding and buildings being washed away, and you can see the outline of some of these buildings on the sides, or the holes where buildings are missing. The stucco finish on this building was one of my favorites, and it had some exhibits on the inside of the industry that had been in town, and you could walk all around, inside, outside, behind, and it was really cool to see. I used to work at a house called Belmead Plantation, and the outside of Belmead Plantation should look like this building. It's a sandstone treatment, and it's rough and not painted over a lot, and it was really cool to see that in a great state of preservation and restoration. There's a bookstore, there's some little restaurants downtown. They were excited to see Santa Claus coming. So this main stretch that I keep showing you is the area that is maintained by the National Park Service, so there is no real modern um, restaurants or anything on this lane, but the main drag up behind these buildings is where a lot of modern businesses and shops and things are. One of the buildings they had in a state of preservation to show the foundations and the changes that had been made over the years, trying to figure out how this house had been used as a boarding house. And you could go out behind it and see the dependencies and how just it was built right into the hill. I really loved the stepped parapet on this building, and the stone stairs that were heavily worn leading up towards the church. It just kind of seemed like you were in a different world. It was so different than what I'm used to. Definitely, if you have bad knees, make plans for driving more because the steps are very uneven and they were a little scary because it was wet the day I was there. I really, really wanted to go in and see the inside of this church, but it was closed to the public because of COVID. And as you walk up past the church, there is a ruin of another church, a Methodist church that has been abandoned for years and years. And you walk past it, and you can really start to see the lay of the land and how the historic downtown district is right on the river. And as you walk on up the hill, you come to a place called Jefferson's Rock, which has an overview of the river and a little bit of town. The leaves were gone off the trees, so I think I got a good view. I don't know how good the view would be in the summertime when it's very leafy and the foliage is up. But it was incredibly chilly that day, and the wind was whipping through this valley, so I didn't spend a whole lot of time at Jefferson Rock, but it was good to get to see it. Walking back down toward town, you pass the church again and kind of come out above everybody's houses and the businesses below. And it was interesting to see how they kind of terraced these areas down and built what they could when they could and left other areas open for gardens. These houses all had ice houses built into the hill and under the garden that you saw above. And it was just really a lot of very steep hills to walk up and down, but it was great to get to see. This building is also maintained by the National Park Service, and now we're getting into the area where more of the businesses and the private residences are. There's a few Airbnbs, some restaurants, some little gift shops. This stone house you could actually stay in as an Airbnb. And it was one of the better maintained. John Brown is lurking in every corner. There's even an old wax museum that you could visit if you wanted to. That guy got me in the window, not going to lie. But there's a whole nother level of these buildings, like a basement level, but they have full entrances. And then, so they look like 2 stories from one side, and then there are 3 or 4 stories from the back side because the hills are so steep. And that was really interesting to get to see. I was trying to figure out where filming locations had been for Gods and Generals. It's a long movie that I haven't seen in a long time, but I do remember being kind of obsessed with it when it first came out. That was back when I was still doing Civil War interpretation and things. I have a couple chairs that look a lot like these, and I was excited to see those in a museum setting. This is one of the only houses that's set up as a private residence. The guy who lived there wanted to see some Union friends of his and walked across the river and actually got shot in the process and died, so they interpret that story. I did not see a lot of African American interpretation that was open. One of the buildings was labeled as having exhibits for that, but it was actually empty. I don't know what COVID has impacted and what it hasn't. One of the coolest things that I didn't realize you could do is the old railroad bridge they have turned into a walking bridge, and this is actually part of the Appalachian Trail. And you can walk from town out along the river across the old bridge that follows the new bridge that the trains still use. And it was a really cool perspective from town, and this old railroad tunnel was really cool to get to see. I didn't explore very much on that side of town as it was starting to get dark and I had to get on to my next destination. But to get to be up close to the tunnel was really, really cool. You can also see all of the different little bridges that have been washed out over the years, and it was just a really cool perspective that I didn't realize that you would be able to get. Now, if you drive around town, up on the top of the hill past the church, there's actually another area that is maintained by the National Park Service. These were private residences that later became a home to an African American college. Buildings are not open to the public currently as they are still working on them, but the view from these were just amazing. They would have been epic houses as private residences setting up over the town and with a great view of the rivers. This house actually overlooks a cemetery today, and the views from the cemetery were actually the best views that I found of Harper's Ferry and getting to see everything. So I highly suggest that if you visit Harper's Ferry, you go up on the hill, check out these buildings, and walk through the cemetery because it's a really beautiful view. I think that if you followed the pathway past Jefferson Rock or Point, it would have brought you up here anyway. But check this out. Let me know if you visit or if you have visited what your favorite parts were, and I would love to hear what you think of these videos. Remember to like and subscribe. Thank you guys.